October 21st. We understand that the Select Board will discuss this on September 24th, so that is an upcoming meeting. Our Clean Energy and Sustainability Committee has a meeting September 25th, so you can also attend that meeting. We meet remotely by Zoom, and you can attend and give more feedback or ask more questions. We are here to present information, take questions, take comments as well, and we can react to that. Really appreciate time and attention and interest of everybody, and time of the presenters. So let's see. So we will take questions and comments at the end. We'll have a Q&A session. If you're in the room, if you could please come to the microphone here and give your name, address, and interest and comment or question. And if you're on Zoom, you can please put the question in the Q&A section of the Zoom meeting. And we appreciate Mike Edwards, Assistant Town Manager, helping us set up and manage the Zoom. So we appreciate all the support from town staff and other volunteers. I think that's mostly it. This presentation has been posted on the town website, along with other information about the new building code. There is a town website on that, so you can access a lot of information that has been made available by DOER and other entities. And we appreciate town staff and others really trying to get that information out so people can be informed about what it would mean for Westford to adopt the specialized opt-in building code. Yeah, so I think that is everything. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dylan and Michael.
Thank you very much, Mike. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dylan Patel. I am the Green Communities Northeast Regional Coordinator for the Department of Energy Resources. And I'm joined here with Michael Rossi.
Hi, I'm Michael Rossi. I'm an Energy Code Specialist with Performance Systems Development, or PSD.
So we're going to take it away with our presentation for the Specialized Stretch Energy Code. Take it away, Michael. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the policy environment and why this code actually exists. And then I'm going to hand it over to Michael to talk a little bit more about the details of the code. So the Specialized Stretch Energy Code kind of came into fruition with the Climate Act that was passed by the Baker administration. This act set greenhouse gas reduction targets for the entire state to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, with interim goals for the previous 2 decades. And as you're all aware, we're kind of running up into 2030. So the Climate Act also kind of authorized the creation via the Department of Energy Resources to develop this specialized stretch energy code, and at the same time it handed over authority for the development of the regular stretch code, which had up until that point had been the purview of the BBRS. So the specialized specialized stretch energy code became available for adoption in January of 2023, and since then there has been a considerable growth in that rate of adoption, and we'll see that in the next few slides. So the building code, the specialized energy code and the stretch code actually were designed and redesigned in a way to focus on buildings, on new construction buildings, and on making them as most efficient as possible. And the idea behind that is that we are anticipating considerable growth in the state of Massachusetts, to the point that by 2050, about a quarter, just over a quarter of our building stock will be new construction. It's much easier to make those new buildings net zero or net zero compliant than existing buildings. Now, of course, we have Mass Save and a bunch of state and federal tools to help make existing buildings much more energy efficient, but it is much cheaper to do that as you are constructing a building. So that's why the Specialized Stretch Energy Code kind of targets new building emissions. And this is particularly pertinent given that the building stock in general is responsible for about a third of greenhouse gas emissions. So we hear a lot of people throughout the state kind of question the role of electrification, both in terms of buildings, but also in transportation. And I think that is a valid response or a valid concern at this point in time. Our grid right now is fairly fossil fuel heavy. Having said that, we have today an array of electric equipment for heating and cooling that are much more efficient than we've had 10 or even 15 years ago, to the point that they're much less carbon intensive, even on a fossil heavy grid, when you're comparing it to heating with gas or propane or oil. And so that is just today. We are anticipating, and as you've seen in the news, some great news about the procurement on offshore wind. We've had an explosion of solar energy throughout the state, and that's only going to continue to grow. So by 2050, if we advance the slide, the grid is going to be much cleaner, much less carbon intensive, to the point that, you know, even with electric resistance heating, which is not that efficient, that's less carbon intensive than heating with any source of fossil fuel. But switching to any sort of heat pump equipment, whether that be air source or even better ground source, then your emissions from heating are basically negligible. So DOER is really pleased to be announcing our new grant opportunity for green communities. So Westford has been a green community for many years now, a decade at this point, I believe, and has received about $1.3 million so far in green communities funding with an active grant right now. And that has translated to fantastic energy efficiency improvements in your municipal stock. So we, recognizing these achievements of these early green communities, we have launched a new grant program called Climate Leaders. And Climate Leaders provides much more enhanced funding to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars for renewable energy and decarbonization, which is pretty relevant for communities like Westford that has already done that groundwork for getting buildings electrification ready. And so one of these criteria for becoming a climate leader is to adopt the specialized stretch energy code. So we're hoping that with this adoption, that it drives forward municipal decarbonization even further. Next slide, please. So before I go over into who has adopted the specialized code so far, I'm just going to give like a very brief overview of what it actually is before Michael kind of delves into the details. So it kind of sits upon a pyramid of 3 energy codes, technically 4, 3 energy codes that exist within the state. And so Westford is party to the stretch code because it is a green community, along with the majority of other municipalities within the state of Massachusetts. If you recall what I said about a few minutes ago, the specialized code has only been available for adoption in the last 16, 17 months, and yet so far we've already had 45 municipalities representing nearly 30% of the state population that have already adopted the specialized code. And that basically is the same as the stretch code with just a few additions to that. And if we go to a map of that, there are quite a few neighbors, Westford's neighbors that have already adopted the specialized code, including Chelmsford, which was earlier this year, Carlisle around this time last year, and Acton. And as you've seen, there's some adoption, there's adoption kind of spreading throughout the state and not just in the Metro Boston area. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael to talk about a little bit of the details about the specialized code.
Sure, thanks, Dylan. So to start off, I just wanted to set the stage of how I'm going to defer to the specialized code. So there's a lot of different names for it. Some people call it the Municipal Opt-in Specialized Code. Some people just call it the Specialized Code, the Opt-in Code. So if I use any of those acronyms, that's sort of what I'm referring to. And if I say the stretch code, that's going to be referring to what the community of Westford's already adopted. So the opt-in code, specialized code, municipal opt-in specialized code, however I say that's going to be really the focus of today's conversation. So I want to start off talking about some quick facts about the code that I think are really important to share. So the specialized code applies only to new construction. There's no impact of the specialized code on existing or historic homes. If you are going to build a new home that is all electric using that heat pump technology that Dylan described above, electric resistance, or ground source heat pump, or air source heat pump, there's no additional requirements of the specialized code as there would be from what you already have to follow. So there's no additional requirements that are new by following this. It does retain the choice to build with natural gas or other types of combustion equipment, but if you do so, there are additional steps that have to be done to meet the requirements. And typically, when considering building a new home, it could be cheaper to build and operate an all-electric house when compared to the base code, primarily because instead of having two systems that are working, like a central AC system and a furnace, you have one piece of equipment sort of that's able to do both. And then the big thing of it is forward thinking and future proofing. So it makes new homes as efficient as possible. It also saves like the future homeowners money if they want to convert the house to all electric. And we'll talk about why in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But there is this requirement in the specialized code for pre-wiring, which is essentially having an outlet nearby any current equipment that's using fossil fuels for space heating, water heating, cooking, or clothes drying. And so you will have a space dedicated for, so if someone moves into the home, they can just plug in a new appliance and it's ready to go. So it's really making that possible for a future homeowner. And there are some pieces of it that were applicable to electric vehicles of the stretch code that the community already follows. But the electric vehicle requirements aren't any different from what's already required by code with the opt-in code. And then as Dylan mentioned, it does unlock a lot of new opportunities for funding through that new Climate Leaders program. All right, so this gives a little bit of a summary of what the requirements are. So as I mentioned, if you're building a new all-electric home, the requirements are the same as they would be under the stretch code. You don't have to do anything differently than you would be doing under the code you already have to follow. But if you are building a new mixed fuel home, there's additional requirements there, like that pre-wiring thing I just talked about. So having an outlet nearby any current fossil fuel heating, hot water heating, cooking, or clothes drying equipment, as well as having a 4 kilowatt solar array on the property if it's under 4,000 square feet. If you're going to be using a home that's over 4,000 square feet, which are typically larger luxury homes, the requirement is actually going to be enough solar on the property to get to net zero. So that might be an 8 kilowatt array or larger, depending on specific specifications of the house. So, and there's also that requirement for the pre-wiring for future electrification. And then, so that's on the residential side. So what you'd have to do for mixed fuel buildings there. On the multifamily residential side, which is over 4 stories or over 12,000 square feet of conditioned floor area, the requirement is to be built to Passive House standards. And Passive House is a third-party certification system that has an American model and a European model. The American model is called FIAS. The European model is called Passive House Institute, and essentially it's a third-party certification program that a project would go through and get certified to show that it meets those standards. Passive House is typically very energy efficient, is like how I like to describe it, like extremely insulated, having a lot of, really taking into consideration the best science of building science, like moisture management, indoor air quality, very low heating and operating costs. And there's certain requirements you have to meet that threshold. And you can build a passive house that is mixed fuel, but if you do that, you also have to meet the electrification ready requirements there. So one piece of the code that I'll talk about a little bit here, but is more applicable to the stretch code, not as much so to the opt-in code, is the HERS rating, or Home Energy Rating System, which is a third-party certification system developed by the Residential Energy Services Network, or ResNet. So a HERS rating is essentially like a miles per gallon sticker for a car, but for a house. And the lower the score, the more efficient the home is. So a HERS 100 is essentially a new house that's built in 2006. And the lower, as I said, the lower the better. And a HERS 0 is a zero energy home. And you can also get negative HERS values as well. So in 2020 and 2021, the average home in Mass was constructed to about a HERS 51. And as part of the stretch code update, the HERS requirements have changed on January 1st, 2023, I believe.
Yeah.
And then again on January 1st, 2024, where the requirements are, if you're following the Green Communities program, as you are right now with the stretch code, the requirement is a HERS index of a 42. And the opt-in code actually has the same exact value for the HERS index, so you have to achieve a 42 as well. So there's no change to this, but the reason I bring it up is because it is a big piece of the code itself. So I just want to provide a little bit of groundwork for it, just some background. All right, so getting into the specifics that we just talked about. So if it's an all-electric new home of any size, the requirement is to achieve a HERS 45 or be built to passive house under both the stretch code or the opt-in code. So as long as you meet a 45, you meet those requirements. And for a new mixed fuel home, if it's under 4,000 square feet, the requirement is a HERS 42, so it's a little bit more stringent than it would be under the all-electric path as a way to reward using all-electric. And then additionally, there's that requirement for the 4 kilowatt solar array, and additionally that wiring for future electrification. If the home's over 4,000 square feet of conditioned floor area, the requirement under the stretch code is the HERS 42 as well. But as I said, you have to have enough solar generation on site to get to a HERS 0 or below, and also that pre-wiring. And then if you're using a new mixed fuel home that's passive house, the wiring for electrification is also required. Then additionally, for homes, additions and alterations, there's no additional requirements than what's already required by the stretch code. So that's the exact same. So if you're doing an addition or alteration, it's the same as what you're already required by code. Historic homes are exempt from the code, especially if it'll damage the historic fabric. I think it's historic form or fabric or function of the building, essentially. So historic homes are also exempt from the energy code requirements in general. All right, so as I mentioned for the solar requirement, so a solar is required for mixed fuel buildings when there is a suitable zone for solar, which is as you see here on the left, the orientation between the west and both southeast and green, that's the zone of house orientation that's most applicable to it. And that's because that's where you're going to maximize the on-site ability to use the solar generation. So the size has to be around or greater than or equal to 300 square feet and be at that orientation. It can be ground mounted as long as it's on site. And it doesn't matter if it's owned by the property owner or if it's a third party, like if you're leasing the panel to someone and they're getting the net metering savings, things like that. One or the other is okay for that. And the code doesn't require trees to be cut down. It's something where if the site is shaded for more than 70% of daylight hours annually, there's no additional requirements for the solar to be there. So that's just a note there. For all electric buildings, new all electric home using those heat pumps or electric resistance systems that Dylan described, the requirements you don't have to use you don't have to add solar PV. That requirement's only applicable to new mixed fuel buildings. So if it's all electric, solar is not required. If you're building a passive house, solar is not required. If it's mixed fuel under 4,000 square feet, you have to have a 4 kilowatt array. If it's a mixed fuel over 4,000 square feet, you have to have enough to get to net zero. And there's other requirements for commercial buildings and other types of residential buildings, which are typically multifamily or things like that. So so that's just some information about the solar requirement here. And I just want to note some of the significant incentives that are available to homes, both through the Mass Save program and other tax credits to do some of this work. So for the Mass Save program, if you're building a new all-electric home, if it's if you have a HERS score that's under 46, there's a $15,000 incentive available to that. And if you go even further and have it under HERS 36, there's a $25,000 incentive available. And on top of the mass-specific Mass Save incentives that are provided, certification with the Energy Star program under the 45L tax credit on the federal level that was extended to 2031 as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. So $2,500 is available for Energy Star certification, and $5,000 is available for a certification to the Department of Energy Zero Energy Ready Homes program. And then on top of that, there's some solar incentives available where a federal tax credit provides 30% of the solar cost through 2032. There's a 15% state tax credit available as well, up to $1,000. There's additional incentives that can be available through net metering, where you can sell some of the electricity generated back to the grid. There's the SMART program that's provided by DOER. There's no sales tax or extra property tax added to the home. And there's also some projects coming up that are forthcoming, like the Solar for All program and 0% interest loans available for a solar system. And then there's also some incentives available for multifamily buildings that are listed here, but I'm not going to get into them in too much more detail, because they're very similar to what I described for the residential. All right, and then this is as I noted before, the requirements for new multifamily buildings over 4 stories and over 12,000 square feet. So under the stretch code, a new all-electric building had 3 different pathways for compliance. There was the HERS index pathway if it's individually separate dwelling units. There's this other pathway that's available in the code called Thermal Energy Demand Intensity, or TEDI. And that's another optional pathway called the Targeted Performance Path in the code. And then there's that passive house certification that we talked a little bit about earlier. So that was required for all electric buildings and mixed fuel buildings. Those are the 3 paths that are available under the stretch code. But under the specialized code, the requirement is for buildings over this size to be built to passive house. And if it's mixed fuel, passive house plus that wiring for future electrification here. All right, so what is passive house? Let's get into it in a little bit more detail. So as I mentioned, there's a third-party certification building verification program with 2 options for certification. There's FIAS, which was formerly Passive House Institute US, and PHI, which is Passive House Institute, which is more the European model. These certifications standards set energy performance and building envelope airtightness requirements. So these buildings are extremely airtight, have really great ventilation systems that provide fresh air, have very good indoor air quality, really great moisture management, and are really great. Passive house can be any type of building, and it's not required to be all electric or net zero. So heating loads can be reduced by 90% or more compared to a typical building in a passive house. And the overall energy demand can be reduced by 60% or more. And as I mentioned, there is a really significant improvement in indoor air quality and occupant comfort when you have that. And that's especially important when you're working with affordable housing projects and you have folks that are struggling to pay their energy bills. I know ACEEE came out with a recent study that showed that 15% of, 1 in 4 disadvantaged communities use 15% of their income on energy bills. And as part of that, there's a strong energy burden available if you're living in an old, inefficient house. So a new passive house is really great for affordable housing as well, because it provides lower utility costs and operating costs for tenants. And there's better indoor air quality, which leads to better health outcomes. It's more comfortable in a passive house because it is so airtight, and you won't notice any temperature differences or drafts or things like that. And it's longer lasting construction and less maintenance needs, because when you build a house well with all the principles of building science taken into consideration, it's going to last longer and you're not going to have as many maintenance needs for it. All right, so we talked a little bit about the incentives earlier, so I'm not going to dig into this in too much detail, but if you are doing the multifamily incentive project, there are incentives available for some of the passive house like certification for pre-construction and post-construction. So you can get some feasibility study done, some energy modeling requirements that have to go into pre-certification and full certification, and then bonuses if you're meeting certain performance standards there. And then and then on top of that, there are those federal incentives that we talked about through the 45L tax credit program for Energy Star and Zero Energy Ready homes as well. All right, so that ends our part of the presentation. I think we'll open up to some questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, guys. So we'll start in the room, and also we'll maybe intersperse with any questions on Zoom. Any questions or comments on the building code, specifically the presentation, but it may be something not covered in the presentation. You know, I think these are the experts, and now would be a good time to make a comment or ask a question. In terms of comments, you do have folks informing the town government. So I, as a representative of Clean Energy Sustainability Committee, happen to hear any comments as well as we consider recommendations and path forward. I will just maybe make a comment and sort of intersperse a question with that, if I may. So if Westford were to adopt this at October fall town meeting, when would it get implemented? So maybe if you guys could recommend the state's recommendation, and then I can follow up with what we will be recommending to select board and town meeting in town. But if you could maybe answer that question to start.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's recommended that there's a 6-month waiting period between adoption and enforcement, and that 6-month period is to provide a little bit of a grace period for those in the construction industry to learn a little bit more about what the requirements are of it. So giving time for flexibility, and it's for buildings permitted after the date where it becomes effective and enforced. So it does give a little bit more time just for flexibility to learn the code, understand the requirements, and know more about the reporting responsibilities. And specifically, I know they recommend that the adoption's on the same time as the stretch code, which is a January or July adoption. So those are the months where you would ideally take it effect, but that's just recommendations. And I'll let Dylan talk in more detail.
Yeah, exactly.
specific.
So in that case, it would be, we do recommend January or July, whichever is the longer of the 6 months. So if you were to put this to town meeting in October, and hypothetically it were approved, it wouldn't be the following January or April, it would be the following July, in which we would recommend it be effective. Now, it is really up to you, actually, to determine when it is. After all, we are making recommendations. But yeah, we just say that we would really like you to do it either the January or July, whichever is the longer of the 6-month waiting period. We usually say 6 to 12 months.
Right, okay, thanks. And Tom, I'll ask you to weigh in here too, but I just want to say that our committee would support that and would recommend that the town plan not to implement it any sooner than 6 months from adoption at town meeting. So rather than January 1st, 2025, that might be July 1st. 2025. I know that as part of the select board material from this past Tuesday, there was a draft town meeting warrant with articles, and I believe I saw the language there on the building code did maybe say January 1st, 2025, but I think that was maybe old placeholder, and that is not our recommendation. Our recommendation would be to adopt it no sooner than 6 months, so I think that would be July 1st, 2025, or maybe later. And I just wanted to mention Tom Teller, a member of our committee, has been one of our point people on this building code adoption. Tom, would you agree with that, and any other comments on implementation date?
I certainly do, and the earliest that we would recommend would be July 1 of 2025. And, when that would be is obviously up to the select board and town meeting ultimately.
Okay, thanks. Great. Any other comments, questions from the room? Yep, go ahead. Please come up.
You want to have this?
And just,
yeah.
and just give us
Paul
at least your name.
Morris,
Please.
Wagon Trail Road, Westford, resident, longtime resident. A couple of questions. One is associated with the meeting itself. Would the select board and the planning board, are they going to take a position with respect to this article at the special town meeting? Or is just the select board?
Right, good question. I'm not sure all of the committees and boards that would take a position on something like this. I don't know if our assistant town managers in the room want to comment on that, but certainly before we get to town meeting, select board will decide if they sponsor the article or not, and then usually the select board takes a position on most, if not all, of the articles on the warrant, so I would expect select board to take a position on that. I do know that Clean Energy and Sustainability Committee will take a position on this article. We certainly are recommending that it go to town meeting and be approved, and the select board sponsor it. So at least those two committees I can expect. I'm not sure about planning board or any other committee. So I don't know if any town staff or anyone else wants to comment on that, but that's a good question.
I can comment on the select board. Mike's exactly right. They'll consider it for inclusion in the warrant, and they may elect to take a position at that point. We've also provided an opportunity for the Permanent Town Building Committee to issue an opinion on it as well. I'll let Jeff speak to the planning board.
Yeah, Jeff, please.
Jeff Morissette, Assistant Town Manager of Land Use and Economic Development. So typically, the planning board is required to provide a recommendation with respect to zoning bylaw amendments. Generally, they don't provide opinions in most cases on that which doesn't relate to zoning unless it somehow falls, plainly in their purview and they're asked to take an opinion. So, so I would expect they wouldn't, but they can certainly be asked.
Right, and I would just add that we've been invited for other municipalities to speak in front of a planning board. We've definitely done that, and we're happy to do that. But Jeff is completely correct. When it comes to town meeting and someone would ask about the position of the planning board, it's usually not written in the warrant. And one member of the planning board would generally say that it's really not under our purview to take a position.
Okay, a second question is, have you had enough history built up to say there's been a market effect on the 45 towns that have adopted this this law, this building code? Has there been any effect on the market? Has the prices gone up, down, sideways, people not building? Have you seen any history along this line? And I'm particularly thinking about the opt-in, not the stretch.
Right. So I think it's really hard to parse out the effect of the specialized stretch code when it comes to other factors within the state of Massachusetts and the broader macroeconomy. So I will say, like, some of the earliest adopters for which it has been effective for at least a year now are fast-growing markets like Watertown, Cambridge, Somerville. They'll keep building to the heavens if they could. And like in the other towns, I feel like it's only just been a few months since it's actually been effective. So there hasn't been any noticeable market effect yet, especially like for some of your neighbors, like Chelmsford or Carlisle. I'll also say that it's also like very hard to kind of parse out what the effect of any code has been, separate from broader inflation, from interest rates, and from supply chain issues. So I think it's going to take a while for us to kind of recognize whether this is going to speed up or slow down construction.
Okay, fair enough. Another question I have is a comment, which is it would be interesting and maybe even helpful for the town to look at a regulation bylaw, I don't know what you call it, that would require or suggest that houses be oriented to best capture the sun. These regulations, these bylaws, these building codes don't demand that houses in a new neighborhood be oriented like flowers towards the sun. And that would seem to me to be a very practical and helpful solution for consumers of the future, right? And I don't know how that gets implemented. That's just a suggestion on my part. But it would seem like that's sort of low-hanging fruit for the state to think about, aligning flowers to the sun, and best I can tell.
Can I interrupt you from your next comment to ask a question based on that comment? Dylan, is that something that could go in the building code in terms of building orientation?
We don't recommend any changes to what exists in the code, and in fact, that gets into all sorts of compliance issues. But I will say that, and Michael can jump in as
Sure.
if I'm incorrect. Site orientation does figure a little bit into how a home is rated for HERS. from
Yes.
what I've seen. It's like one of the
Yep.
levers that you can turn.
Absolutely.
So it's something that is like you can play with, but the state doesn't necessarily have any kind of mandate. And at the local level, I've not seen any sort of mandate across any of the 351 municipalities so far.
Okay, just a
Okay,
comment.
just wanted to get some more feedback, but appreciate the comment.
Okay, so I'm all in favor of this article, by the way, as you might expect from my comments. And I think essentially that all electric houses are sort of in parity now with conventional housing construction. And so this is really a consumer protection. This is for those who end up having to replace a fuel-based system in the future. It's going to cost a lot to rewire a house, to renovate the house for that. So doing it up front seems to me to be a smart thing to do, and I'm all in favor of this. And by the way, we're talking just about the specialized opt-in code. We're not talking about the stretch code. That's our baseline, right? So there's nothing at our town meeting that's suggesting or offering up backing out of a green community program. Is that your? Yes, Mike?
Yes, that is correct. The only, I'd say, relevant related article that I have seen, that I understand is proposed for this fall town meeting, or any other initiative from our committee, is to adopt this specialized opt-in building code. Nothing to do with green communities or the stretch code at this point. However, I will take this opportunity to say that the Clean Energy and Sustainability Committee has recommended that Westford become a climate leaders community, which is the next level above green communities. As you saw, part of that requirement is to adopt the specialized opt-in building code. That's not going to town meeting or the select board yet, but the Clean Energy Committee has made that recommendation, and we are in the process of trying to figure out how to make that happen and when that can happen. So that is, again, something that is kind of related. That's been a recommendation from the committee, but nothing of such is also on the special town meeting warrant. So the only thing that is going, which is a piece of this, is to adopt the specialized opt-in building code.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Let's pause in the room and see on the Zoom. Any questions on the Zoom, Mike?
Yes, we've got, well, we had a few questions submitted in advance that I'll go ahead and read in the order in which we received them. So first would be a comment. I'm going to toggle through emails here. Okay, so the first question comes from Jeffrey Brem, and it is, I have 3 questions that come with this. I'll do them one at a time, let you answer one at a time. What is the community going to say to longtime residents that have the intentions of doing a major renovation of an older, outdated building that happens to be over 1,000 square feet, and they find out after they hire an architect at $12,000+ and others like an HVAC company that they would be forced to renovate the entire home to meet the standards, including the HERS and blower door tests, doubling or tripling the renovation cost, or making it uneconomical? Then they would have to move to get what they want. So that's question 1.
Yep.
Can we answer each a turn?
Yep, that's
Yeah.
what I was planning.
So I'll let Mike go deeper into this, but that's actually talking about the stretch code,
Okay.
which Westford is already party to. And we've had, okay, I will say that we've had like many questions and comments like this, and it's completely understandable. And to that effect, we actually had the bulk of those comments be submitted earlier this spring during a listening session. And because of that, we've proposed changes to the existing stretch code, which will actually increase the HERS requirement. No, increase in the sense that it makes it
reduces
easier.
stringency.
So less stringent.
Yeah.
Higher is easier in this case for existing buildings. But as I've said before, this pertains to the stretch code, which is not the focus of tonight's meeting.
Okay.
Mike, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, and as Dylan mentioned, there are draft proposed updates to the stretch code itself that are going to actually be due on September 17th, I believe.
Yes, if anyone would like to join.
So if anyone has questions regarding that specific piece of the relating to existing buildings, of how it's in the stretch code, DOER is accepting comments on that. About the potential changes that they're considering. So the changes are pretty significant with what they're proposing. So right now, the requirements for a existing building are a 52, 55, or 58 right now. But, and that's it all depends on if you're using solar and electric with that. So the requirement goes up if you're using one or the other. So under the new update that's proposed, it's actually going to align better with the base code, which is the code that other communities have to follow that aren't part of the green communities. And that's actually going to be a 65, a 70, or 75, I believe.
Yes.
So, and that's the lower the score, the more stringent. So the fact that they're lacking the requirements that much is pretty significant and might be able to alleviate some of those concerns.
Can I just ask a clarifying question on this comment? When I heard it, I thought of what I saw in a slide that the home additions and alterations are the same as the stretch code. So
Right.
concern about a renovation is not a material concern for adopting the specialized opt-in code.
That's correct,
right?
yeah.
That's
Yeah.
not a reason to be against the specialized opt-in code.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah,
okay.
and that's correct. And I think
I just wanna
that
make
comment
that
is more in line with what's in the stretch code. The opt-in code doesn't have any impact on existing buildings.
Right, yeah, it's completely valid, and we understand, but
Yes.
it's not what is going to be voted on at town meeting, or changed at town
Right,
meeting.
right. Adopting the specialized opt-in code doesn't make such a renovation harder.
Yeah, correct.
Because there's no
th-
impact
There's no
There's no
change.
impact,
There's no
right.
change.
Fall back to the stretch code, which, as you said, state has had some feedback and is considering some changes.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Part B of his question, is the community willing to accept any change that the state may affect to these regulations in the future without any input or acceptance of the town of Westford, since once adopted, any future amendments that the state puts forward are automatic?
Yeah, so so when Westford does adopt this, put this to town meeting, it is adopted as is, such that any future changes made by DOER do become automatic for the town of Westford. The same is true for the stretch code. And we don't do that without extensive public outreach. I will say that when the stretch code was last updated, on behalf of DOER, I would say that the public outreach for that was quite lacking. Since this year, we kind of learned our lesson, and that's why we've had a much more extensive outreach session when we did those proposed changes for the stretch code. Any additional changes that will be made to the specialized code will not come without some kind of public feedback session. So that any citizen of the town of Westford is welcome to be part of that, but the town itself would not be voting on future changes.
Yeah, and just to add on that a bit, I mean, the stretch code itself has been available for adoption in Massachusetts since 2008. So the code's changed over time, and the codes are the changes are usually more reflective of updates in technology and things that result from the national model code adoption, update process. So the International Energy Conservation Code is the primary code that this is based on. And with that, IECC is what we refer to it as. That gets updated every 3 years. So typically, when the code gets updated, it's usually to align more closely with the newer version of that national model code that becomes available when it becomes available. And that's one of the big pieces of updates. Massachusetts in particular, though, does tend to go above and beyond the requirements that are in that base code. That's in the national model code that's developed. So there are more stringent requirements there, but as things get updated, a lot of the time it is really just to reflect more closely with what's done with that national piece of national model example.
The third part of his question is a question and a comment. Why do this? Really, the costs are absurd, and the payback is over 38 years. And this is not going to solve the climate crisis, not even a bit. It sounds good to say you did something, but this is not it. I'm not sure there's a question there, but.
But if you could
So
comment
that's
on
a-
cost, added cost, I think that is a good theme I hear in that question.
I think the cost and your payback is really going to depend on what kind of house you're building, right? The size of your house, your kind of plug loads, whether you choose to build all electric or with any kind of gas appliance. And if you do build the latter, whether you choose to have a solar that you want to have owned outright versus through a third-party model. So there is a lot of variables in play there. and so that also affects your payback period. So we can talk a little bit more about the cost in a bit, to the point about kind of like the impact. So I like to say that, you know, it's great that we live in a federal system, even though I am British. But that also means that we have to affect change at different levels of government, right? So the fact that, you know, Westford itself does not have a population that's the same as Boston or, you know, like the entire state of Texas or whatever, we have to make, change has to be made incrementally just because of the form of government that we have. So, and that's the only way we can make any sort of progress, really. And it's the same at the international stage. Like, you can only make progress so much so that you're a citizen of the United States and not a citizen of China. So circling back to the costs, so even with, so I'll say that the, you know, small residential does have a lot of variables to it. We've seen with the passive house construction, multifamily buildings, studies within the state of Massachusetts, and I think by the Rocky Mountain Institute, have seen like cost increases to the tune of about 1 to 4%, based on a subset of passive house buildings. Passive House, FIUS, Passive House Institute US, came up with that study based on a subset in Massachusetts. And from when I've spoken to them, they've said that those cost increments were before incentives. So if you do factor in the mass save incentives, then you're pretty much cost neutral. You know, there is a learning curve to building passive house, multifamily apartments, or just a regular building. But I think it is going to be the standard in Massachusetts sooner or later, considering the fact that 45 municipalities representing nearly a third of the population in mostly fast-growing towns have already adopted it. So this is, we're expecting like a big S-curve, basically, between now and 2030, in the rate of adoption, in the rate of construction of passive house units. So with that, we're hoping that there will be like that, you know, the learning by doing, being able to slim down your soft costs over time, and getting that expertise so that you can build cost efficiently.
Any further comment? Okay. The next is a comment submitted by Walter Erickson. It is my opinion that the town should not adopt the specialized stretch code. The code requirements now are increasingly harder to meet and add significant cost to housing in Massachusetts. The specialized code will add even more. The requirement to pre-wire a house alone will add over $25,000 to the cost of a single-family home. The statement that this is easier and inexpensive is not correct. I have built all electric homes in Westford, but I don't think you should be forced to do so.
Okay, so the first comment was about the pre-wiring. So that was the second comment. The first comment was about the
code requirements now are increasingly harder to meet.
Got it, right. Yeah. So again, that is something that we have heard a lot, and I think that goes back to the first point I ever made, was that you know, DER has taken a lot of this feedback when it came to the update of the stretch code, and we are proposing a lot of changes, as Mike had mentioned, that will make building construction for renovations easier. Renovations easier, but also new construction. We're adding, we're reducing the HERS stringency for new construction that's built with
Embodied carbon.
With embodied carbon, thank you.
Yep.
With low embodied carbon, and we're also reducing the requirements for certain highly ventilated buildings, like a hospital, the solar requirements for that. So we're taking a lot of feedback at heart. And we hope that that will reduce some of the anxieties among the builder community. To the point about the pre-wiring, I don't have any figures that will contest the $25,000 quote, and I recognize the expertise of that builder who's built all electric homes. I would say that the pre-wiring itself is very much limited to whatever appliances that you have that are fossil fuel. So wiring you already have to wire a house for all of your plug loads, right? That's going to be true for any building that you build. The requirement of the specialized energy code, if you choose to build mixed fuel, is to have that extra conduit, that wire, to wherever place that you have a fossil fuel appliance that can run at a 240 volt circuit. So we're talking about 4 extra wires circuits maximum, and that's always going to be cheaper to do that as you build the building than if you have to do that after the fact 10 years down the line, because then you have to rip down the drywall and then you have to hire an electrician, and so it's just going to be a lot easier to do that once as you build the building.
Yeah, and building on that, when it comes to being cost competitive, I mean, it's something where there's no change in cost necessarily if you're building a new all-electric house. Like, you don't have to do those additional things. That's only if you're choosing to install new combustion equipment in 2024, where, as we know, we're trying to move away from that as much as possible to meet some of massive climate goals. So if you build a new all-electric home, it's the same cost as it would be before. Like, it's the same as what it would be cost already to build a new all-electric home. So the penalties are only, I'm not going to call them penalties, but the additional requirements are only there if you're building new mixed fuel. It's not applicable if you're building an all-electric from the start.
Yeah, and Michael had mentioned right at the beginning while we were making our presentation that all-electric homes do have certain cost savings when it comes to the construction, because you have an integrated heating and cooling system. That's not, you don't have to have a separated cooling or a heating, with a fossil fuel system. You can have a heat pump do both, right?
Yeah, and one other piece I wanted to just get to before I forgot is with a new all-electric home, you can still use a combustion backup generator in the home, and that doesn't disqualify it from being all-electric. So if you have a backup system, that generator that is like natural gas, that's totally okay. You can still use it and be considered all-electric.
Okay. We had 2 questions submitted in person to our land use department. I'll read each one. How might the adoption of the specialized code impact the pending library expansion project, assuming a building permit application is submitted after the effective date? As follow-up to this, we have asked that question to the owner's project manager and are waiting some figures on that. We don't have anything at this point.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if there's anything else
So-
you can add now in the moment, that'd be great. I don't know if you're familiar enough with our library building
I can't
project.
remember if this was asked during the select board meeting. I don't believe so, was it?
I don't remember.
So
They asked questions in terms of how it might impact potential projects that the town has.
we have Sue Thomas, who's willing to answer that.
Yeah, please, yeah. Yeah.
So I'm a little out of date, but
You
Just give your name.
Sue
yeah,
Thomas,
and-
7 Old Homestead. But I served on the library committee for a while, and the architect and the group spoke at length about the current stretch code and the potential adoption of the specialized code, and it is an all-electric building. So the intent, and I believe the fact now, is that it will not be impacted regardless of when it's permitted, but it would be good to double check my understanding with the Permanent Town Building Committee.
Yeah. And you said that this was an expansion, right? They're not knocking anything down.
It's a renovation.
Right, I understand it's a renovation. I don't know
And
about this.
Renovation and expansion.
Yeah.
So even the expanded area would still have to follow with the regular stretch code. It wouldn't be impacted by this opt-in code because it's not new construction.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, that's
Obviously,
helpful.
without many details, you can't answer that one specifically. We'll be sure to follow up with any information.
I would recommend you also, double check.
Right,
with
but
your
that's a
permanent town
great to know,
building
Mike, that group is working on that question. Yep, great.
Okay. Last question that we had submitted before the meeting. What are the implications if someone initially builds an all-electric home and then later, say a year after the initial construction, decides to install a gas appliance such as a range or a fireplace?
Okay, so in that hypothetical scenario, if you have all electric appliances and your building commissioner issues the certificate of occupancy, I think you'd still have to have permanent. Well, I think that also gets into complications because that outside of the code, because you'd have to have a gas line installed into your home. But like the code wouldn't really factor into that. Like once it's built, it's built. Once the certificate of occupancy has been issued, then we don't really.
Yeah, I think it would be something where you check with your building inspector on the additional requirements to put that in, if that's the case. I think it's more work with the department on that, not necessarily code specific.
Was there a comment from the audience on that?
Oh, I said propane. I mean, it's
Oh, okay.
given all electric cars, and we added propane after the fact for.
Got it.
Okay, and folks didn't hear that right. The comment was one way to do such a renovation to a fireplace example would be using propane. So maybe different than running a natural gas line from the main.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but that's a fair question. Is how does that play in? So yeah, we'd appreciate if maybe you guys could help us track down an answer to that. And maybe in addition to what I heard, which was check with your town building commissioner, but our town building commissioner might have that question. So it might be good, if you could just help us, think a little bit more about that. I think that's a fair question. So anything you can help us with, now in the moment, now
Certainly.
would be
And
helpful.
I work pretty closely with a team of energy code experts, so I can run that by them, see if they have any answers to that. One thing I will note though is if you are building, for it to be considered all electric, there can't be any combustion equipment installed or piping for such equipment. That's also how it's phrased in the code as well.
I think if I understand the gist of the question, it's more, does the introduction of combustion equipment retroactively trigger the requirements around, say, solar or anything else?
Yeah, the code. I believe the code is silent on that, so I believe that you get a free pass on that.
I wouldn't think so, because you've already got your occupancy permit, and that's just a choice that the homeowner can choose to add. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, please.
Sure.
One Burnham Pond Way, Westford, obviously. Going to be building a completely solar and geothermal home shortly, and the question of the fireplace just came up, and so we would be all electric. Would the gas fireplace then disqualify them because they wanted to put just a small propane tank for it's not for heating the home primarily, it's just for more ambiance, and would that then disqualify the entire?
So I think if you were to add any sort of, as I said, combustion equipment, piping for the equipment into the
Right.
home, that would make it a mixed fuel building. So it's still able to meet the requirements, but would have to add that solar and pre-wiring requirement.
Okay,
So you could still do it, it doesn't disqualify it, but it would just be under that mixed fuel path.
okay, but then going back to the statement earlier about if it's added later,
If it's added later,
then, there's no control
we're
over
not going
that.
to go after you.
Right, okay. So that they would be having a standby generator as well, so that propane equipment would not affect that, but the fireplace would.
Yeah, and I think one suggestion I have too is adding new, and this might just be a controversial thing, but adding new combustion equipment to a very airtight home could also add some potential dangers to the project, like fire safety, backdrafting of combustion equipment into the home, could lead to concerns around carbon monoxide, things like that. So I think generally it's better nowadays to build a home without it, just because when you're building an envelope that's so airtight, it's harder to introduce those in case of those specific concerns.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you for those questions.
Okay. We do have 1.5 questions on the chat, or on the Q&A on the Zoom. Diane Wood writes, "This is a great goal. Questions. Number 1, how does this impact MBTA community's efforts? It seems to conflict with encouraging developers to build housing, making it more complicated."
So again, I think the stringency of the specialized stretch code, especially when it comes to MBTA communities, would mostly impact obviously the multifamily. So in that case, it will be the passive house requirement. It's a steep learning curve. It definitely is. But I think, it takes a lot of practice and to get those costs down. We do recommend, if for developers that are kind of being introduced or stepping into the passive house world, that they kind of have a very good team behind them who can advise on the design, on the specs of everything. But I personally, and this is not a DOER opinion, but I think zoning has a much greater impact on housing costs than building codes. So I believe that having the MBTA communities and the specialized code together is not necessarily conflicting. It just basically means that you're going to have higher density housing that's going to be built to a better standard. And we've seen this again with most of the 45 communities. I'd say maybe 30 of them are within the MBTA communities. They're under that law because they're in the Metro Boston area.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I heard that from a state level. I recognize from a state level, both MBTA communities and fighting climate change and promoting more stringent building codes are both state goals. I'd say at the local level, Clean Energy and Sustainability Committee did recommend town meeting adopt MBTA communities, and now does recommend that Westford adopt the specialized opt-in building code. So I'd say that state government and our committee does support both, and I appreciate, Dylan, your commenting about that it is possible to do both, but I certainly appreciate the spirit of the question there. Thanks.
She has an additional comment, well, several more. Let me go through them one by one. 4,000 square feet may seem quite large, but current size of Toll Brothers houses in town is upwards of 4,500. Not a question there.
Yeah, so to respond to it though, if you're building over 4,000 and you're using all electric, the requirements are the same. If it's over 4,000 square feet and you're using combustion equipment for heating, space heating, water heating, cooking, or clothes drying, you have to have enough solar on site to get to net zero, which is either through a HERS 0 or below or a FIAS 0 certification.
Yep. And I assume these Toll Brothers houses are either already constructed or in planned development or something in Westford.
It's dirt right now.
Oh, it's dirt right now. Okay, so to the extent that they'll be affected by it would be whether they get the permit by July of 2025.
Right,
Or whatever.
our implementation date.
Yeah.
Right, that's a good point, yep.
On the 4,000, you said it's 4,000 conditioned space. If they're building.
Yes, yep,
If they're building a 3,600 square foot home on 2 levels,
yep.
and they want to finish the basement for another 1,000 square feet, do they then, and it's mixed use, do they then have to put in enough solar? So does the basement add finished space in the basement that's conditioned? By finishing that, does it put it over that threshold?
Yeah, so the conditioned space.
Can you repeat the question or the gist of it, please?
Sure, yeah, I think the question is, if you have a 3,600 square feet, first floor and second floor combined, new construction, and you can insulate a basement to be conditioned, would that be required to meet that zero energy requirement? What I would say is, if this conditioned space, for those that don't know, is essentially space that is intentionally heated. So space where you might, if you have like a furnace system that goes to the system anywhere where you're really intentionally heating. So if there are registers on the floor for the system, and if you are insulating it like you would anything, that would qualify as conditioned space, and I believe would be part of it. If you were to condition it after the project and you not do it right away, I think the impact would be a little bit different. But if you're finishing it,
So don't finish the basement, if you fall under the 4,000 square feet, finish it later.
Yeah, so, right, if you could, speak into the microphone, or we'll try to repeat the question, but, right, I think it was just, right, confirming your definition of conditioned space, which is the quality of the home size in terms of, that's relevant in terms of what rules do you have to follow. So it's that sort of intentionally conditioned space in a finished basement, you're saying could fall under that if it meets those conditions.
Yeah,
And if it's an unfinished
space like a basement, then it would not count
Then it
towards
wouldn't
that
count, no,
4,000
exactly.
square feet
Yeah,
amount.
so to quote the code directly, in Chapter 2, the code defines conditioned space as an area, room, or space that is enclosed within the building thermal envelope and that is directly or indirectly heated or cooled. Spaces are indirectly heated or cooled when they communicate through openings with conditioned space, when they are separated from conditioned spaces or by uninsulated walls, floors, or ceilings, or where they contain uninsulated ducts, piping, or other sources of heating and cooling. So, and then the conditioned floor area is defined as the horizontal projection of the floor is associated with a conditioned space. So that should just give some indication there. And for more specifics, I'd reference the definitions in the code if you want to dig into that in more detail.
So yeah, and so essentially your house is going to be like a continual thermal envelope, right? It's going to be all wrapped around with certain kinds of with insulation. If your basement is, for a lack of better definition, a hole in the ground, then that wouldn't count towards your conditioned floor area. It's until you create some kind of penetration into it so that there is like a junction between the insulated and uninsulated space, and then you insulate the basement and make it part of the conditioned space. That would be I'm guessing that would be after the fact and after it's been constructed, and that would count as an addition. So that would just fall under the regular stretch code. But if you're just to build a house that's 3,600 square feet and leave the basement unfinished, then it would fall under the smaller requirement.
Yeah, and I've seen projects too before where there might be partially conditioned basements where some piece of it would be conditioned space and then some piece of it isn't conditioned space. And when you have that, there has to be an air barrier between the two spaces. So I think ultimately it's if you're insulating the basement floor, or sorry, the basement ceiling or the foundation walls. I think that's really where the difference is. And if you're insulating the foundation walls and putting a heating system there, meeting the definitions of conditioned space in the code, yes, you would have to meet the 4,000 square feet requirement.
Thanks. Does that help clarify the square foot requirements? Okay, great.
thanks, yep.
Guys.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else on
I think
Zoom?
there were
Yep,
two other
there's-
questions, right?
Still going. What is the requirement to update to code every 5 years?
It's we follow the IECC cycle, which is every 3 years. There have been years, or cycles rather, where there haven't been any changes or any significant changes, especially when it comes to, for example, like the Haas scores. Having said that, we follow the IECC, the 3-year cycle, so the next one would be 2027.
Yeah, and I think reasons for some of that confusion is I think the building code itself, which is the 9th edition right now, becoming the 10th edition, that is effective, I think, every 5 years or so, but I might not be specific on that. But the energy code has a specific amendment in the building code to be updated every 3. So even if the 9th edition is effective for 5 years and the 10th edition is effective for 5 years, the energy code within the building code in Chapter 11 for residential and Chapter 13 for commercial, those follow the code that is referenced by that, and that's just because there's a little bit of different authority between the Board of Building Regulations and Standards, the BBRS, and which is administrators of the building code, and the DOER, who's responsible for the energy portion of the building code.
Okay, and these are continuations of Diane Wood's question. Although this is all new, is there any data or findings from those towns that approved the code in 2023?
I've reached out to them several times. Unfortunately, I haven't heard back on any systematic feedback. I think, again, there has been a general slowdown statewide just because of macroeconomic factors. I've heard from some building inspectors in certain municipalities that they might have like issues with the stretch code, but they don't have any issues at all with the specialized code. Again, like if you think about it, the stretch code is the big jump, and the specialized code is the small one. So from building inspectors, there haven't been so much of an issue. But again, in terms of like hard data, unfortunately, we don't have that. We're working on it, but we don't have that right now.
Kind of following up on that, because we have had a few questions on the the impact in towns that have passed it. Can you speak a little bit to what you're working on now in terms of that cost data?
So we are working with consultants and with some towns on cost data. Unfortunately, we're still in the QA/QC period, so we can't share any of that data publicly right now.
Can I just follow up? Do you have expected timing of releasing such data?
The next few months.
Okay, next few months. Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, and I think the reason for the delay might be to try to align better with the requirements for the updates to the code as well. So there are going to be a few different changes to it that are coming out. So I think it's more just to align. So the delay is just more for that, based, I would say.
Some of the proposed changes.
Some of the proposed changes, yeah. So they're not active yet, but they will be as of, I believe it's early 2025 is the goal right now, subject to change. So I think the cost data is going to be published when that update takes effect, I would say. So that's why next few months. So I think the goal is probably to have that new data available like January 1st, I would think. But I can't say that directly, but I think that would be my guess.
Diane's final comment is, also I saw requirements on ADLs.
Is that referring-
ADLs or ADUs?
Yeah, that was my question.
I'm assuming it's ADUs, but Diane, would you care to clarify that?
And what is the acronym?
Accessory dwelling unit.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was
And
guessing that's what she said, but.
yeah, so relating to accessory dwelling units, right now the code doesn't specifically address them in the stretch code. And again, this is more of an impact for the stretch code, not the specialized code. What I would say to it is that the code isn't really directly referencing it now, but as part of the update that DOER is proposing, that's going to be still accepting public comments up until the 16th. One of the updates is to provide specific HERS values for accessory dwelling units, and noting the HERS values for those are going to be a 52, 55, or 58, depending on if it's all electric, if there's it might be embodied carbon, correct, with that new credit.
That also has the embodied carbon credit. So,
yeah, so
52 for mixed fuel.
Yeah, 52 if it's a mixed fuel accessory dwelling unit, 55 if it's a like with all electric dwelling unit, and a 58 if it's all electric and uses that embodied carbon credit that's available.
Because the solar wouldn't figure into it because it's an ADU.
Yeah, so that's a little bit complicated jargon stuff, but that's more just updates to the stretch code, not the specialized code. Yes.
And she did confirm it is, yes, units.
Yeah, okay, great.
Paul Lemieux, I actually build a lot of ADUs.
Yep.
Would that then pertain to the entire structure or just the cutoff between the new ADU and the existing structure? And a lot of them now are being designed because of the limit of square footage of living space that's permittable. They are often being combined between the two of common spaces for people to share.
Okay.
And that gets them over the threshold of the maximum that they can use for living space and be permitted as an ADU. Am I correct in that?
Jeff Morissette. So it is true that we have many ADU applications that are either inside an existing dwelling or in addition to an existing dwelling, and in some cases there are some sort of shared space between the two. We are also seeing some detached accessory dwelling unit requests as well, but we have a whole variety here in Westford.
Right. So if you're thinking about like a dormer on top of a garage, for example, that's attached to a building, that would be classed as an addition. So in that case, the stretch code would kick in. If it's detached from the building, I believe it's considered as new construction.
It would, yeah, but it would go under the ADU requirement, I think.
Under the ADU requirement,
Yeah,
but it
if
would
it's
might still
detached.
have to apply with the specialized code.
Yeah, so I think so the way I would like to describe it is you can do a HERS rating on a dwelling unit, and a dwelling unit is defined as a single unit providing complete independent living facilities for one or more persons, including permanent provisions for living, sleeping, eating, cooking, and sanitation. So if there's a separate, so I think if it's like combined but separate, it is a little confusing, but I do think part of the new update is to clarify the language around them a little bit.
But if you have those combined facilities where you're sharing like a living unit or a sanitary unit or kitchen equipment, then that would be classed as an addition because it's not considered as its own separate dwelling unit. It's classed as, for the purposes of the code, it's basically like extending your house in a way. So the stretch code would kick in that effect.
Dylan, what if they were constructed simultaneously?
So you would have
Built your house and
you'd
your
have a new
ADU.
house, and you'd have like you'd probably have like a separate living quarters that's completely detached from the new house.
Correct. Would they consider all that square footage in its entirety, or would those be two separate,
Those would be two separate buildings.
even permitted at the same time?
I believe so.
My experience has been that oftentimes the new home and the ADU are blended together, so that there's not a distinct cutoff like is being kind of assumed here. So then, what then becomes ADU and has to fall under the requirements, and the old section, you're not gonna get a blower door test.
You
you're not-
can't do a blow. Yeah, you're right.
You can't do any of those things, so where then do you then call off the cutoff that this is new, that's old, this is common space? They're oftentimes being blended together because they're a family living together, but they need that little neutral ground.
Mhm.
That's, hey, this is yours, this is ours, we can share some space together and enjoy living together, but they're not completely separate.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we'll have to take a deeper dive into that because again, the ADU requirements are changing, and as far as I understand, it kind of just all depends on whether it's physically the one individual dwelling unit and the fact that it has a completely separate living and cooking quarters is separate from the building itself, in which case it will be classed as new construction. But when you get into the nuances, like both of those examples where it's constructed simultaneously or it's like an addition to an existing house, then I think we'd have to provide some sort of written answer for that.
Yeah, and just plug here, PSD does provide a code question hotline that's available as part of the Mass Save program. So I can give you my card afterwards. It's a hotline with a phone number or email for any code-related questions.
That first rater regularly, and sometimes even they're a little bit lost.
Yeah, so.
So
and-
I can't get, even going through them, a lot of the information that I need, so it's just this kind of gray lost area.
Yeah, for sure. So I definitely recommend reaching out to our hotline. As I said, I work with a team of energy code experts, so we can work together to try to find an answer. If we can't find an answer for you, we'll defer to DOER and try to get some clarification on that we can provide. So,
In all honesty, most of them have all been electric anyway, just because grandma doesn't necessarily want to be playing with an electric stove, a gas stove
Gas
any
stove.
longer.
Yeah.
And it's just easier to put a ducted split system in than it is
Yeah.
to try to tie to the existing systems. Most of the time it is anyway, but it's just that gray area. in the
Just
middle.
understanding what you actually have to do. Yeah, I completely get that.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, yeah, appreciate some open questions about ADU, accessory dwelling units, and yeah, we'll look for DOER and PSD to maybe point us to or provide us some additional information. It sounds like that is going to be a topic of a lot of interest in Westford if your department and boards are getting permit applications. So yeah, if you could help us follow up on that, we'd appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And for anyone interested or has any code questions, I can share my card after as well, and feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to
And
get
that's
answers.
just a Westford thing. I'm working on probably 7, 8, or 8 of them right now.
Yeah.
In certain phases of them, so, it's definitely gonna be addressed.
Yeah, for sure. And I know my colleague Bill is actually providing some training soon for the building inspector in Westford and surrounding communities. So we do provide that service as part of the Massive Energy Code technical support system. So so if there's questions, we can give you advice. We can think about help strategize some of the questions there. And yeah, so just when you have stuff, we're happy to reach out and we can work together on that. Thanks.
There's no additional questions.
Nothing else from Zoom. Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions from the room? Great, Sue.
Hi, Sue Thomas, 7 Old Homestead again. I just wanted to respond to Diane's question with how I think about how the MBTA zoning bylaw and the specialized code adoption go together. So I believe we owe a huge debt of gratitude to the land use department, who I think put years of effort into the MBTA zoning bylaw that we've adopted, and that it has a lot of sustainability incentives embedded in it to get us to really useful, productive housing. But I think of housing as an infrastructure investment that's going to last 30 to 50 years. And one big thing we talked about as a community with regard to MBTA was the economic development piece of it and the tax consequences for the town in terms of bringing in revenue. And if we want to do that over the life of this infrastructure, it needs to be competitive and effective for those residents in the housing component in the MBTA zones. And for that to happen, it can't be obsolete within 5 years. It needs to be current and competitive, and it needs to be effective for the tenants who live there in terms of being energy efficient for them and inexpensive month over month for them to pay the rent and their utility bills. So to me, we have this wonderful zoning that we've already adopted, and we just have this one little piece we have to take step to protect it and make sure that it serves the interests of the town the way we expect in the years ahead.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Sue.
Thank you, Sue. Jeff Morissette, I can't pass this opportunity up. I have two questions. So first, you mentioned where sometimes you may have to provide some on-site solar.
Yep.
The question is, what about if there is solar placed maybe partially on the lot or on an adjoining lot with benefit of a permanent solar easement? Do you think something like that could be used to satisfy the requirement? Say it's just the ideal location, it's not quite on your property, but you have the permanent permissions to do that. Do you think something like that could be used to qualify?
I think the way that the code is written is that the solar itself, the solar infrastructure has to be with on-site.
So an easement wouldn't qualify if it was adjoining your site?
That's a good question. I don't think I have the answer.
Just want
to
to think about that.
Yeah.
And then the second question is, I heard that there may be some historic exemptions or historic properties. Mike, can you just clarify for folks, what do you mean by that? What are some examples? I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can reference the code section specifically for historic buildings. It's an R501.6, which is the chapter for existing buildings. It says provisions of this code relating to construction, repair, alteration, restoration, and movement of structures and changes of occupancy shall not be mandatory for historic buildings, which are defined as any building or structure that is one or more of the following.
It has to be recognized as historic by like the state, either the State Housing Preservation Office, the SHPO, a local historic committee, the Historic Preservation Committee, or I think it's like a certified, it has to be on the National Register as well.
Yep.
Yeah. So any one of those.
Yep, so going back to the requirements there, if it qualifies under the definition of historic building, the report's been submitted to the code official and signed by the owner or a registered design professional, a representative of the State Historic Preservation Office or the Historic Preservation Authority having jurisdiction, demonstrating that compliance with the provision would threaten, degrade, destroy the historic form, fabric, or function of the building. So for your records, if you're curious, it's section R501.6 of the code.
And we've made, so one of our proposed changes was actually a clarification because we got a number of comments, both in the North Shore and in the South Shore and Islands, about like extensive additions to historic homes. I think one of the changes was that would still be exempted from provisions of the code or follow prescriptive under the base code.
So what it says here is, and this is the proposed update, so it's not effective yet, but it is proposed by DOER. Alterations, additions, or change of use covered by the certain sections are subject to the maximum HERS rating, except for historic buildings, which may opt to follow the prescriptive compliance pathway of the code. So that's correct.
You kind of lost me. Are you talking about the stretch code or the specialized code?
This is a stretch
Well, technically,
code
yeah, this is a stretch code question because it's a historic building.
So, yeah, that's a stretch code specific thing, but yes.
So can you, just to clarify, for the specialized code, is it true that there's no difference to historic homes, then under the stretch
So
code.
think about a historic home as an existing home. So in that case, the specialized code would have zero relevance for it.
Okay,
Yeah.
right. And then, again, there are exemptions for historic homes, but they have to meet certain requirements.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty easy to get certificate, somebody to certify from your historical preservation committee that if hypothetically you had a historic home and you wanted to do an addition or alteration for it, and and again, now we're talking about the regular stretch code, which Westford is party to, then you wouldn't have to do that. You just show that certification to Jeff, and they would just have to follow certain provisions, minimum provisions, basically, that's under the base code.
Yeah, and to address the specific question about the solar provisions of the opt-in code, I would just I would reference section RC 105 of the code. That'll give you more insight there.
Okay, great. Thanks for those questions. Any other questions or comments on Zoom or in the room? One more. Yep, please.
I have a comment. My name is Sam Palmer. I want to thank you guys for coming out tonight. You have been by far the most knowledgeable on the subject. I've held a construction supervisor's license for about 25 years. I've taken numerous classes leading up to the recent code change, energy code change, and the opt-in code. And frankly, everybody's a little confused. That brings me to my next point. I'm a little confused because you brought up the example of the fireplace creating a mixed-use house, but you had commented earlier that you could have a generator on the outside of your house that wouldn't trigger a mixed-use house. The BTUs generated by those outside of your house generators are substantially more than a fireplace, and I think fundamentally this kind of thinking is troublesome to me. You had mentioned earlier, very early on, that the electrical grid is carbon heavy now, and it's the goal in the future to get away from that reliance on carbon-based fuels. But what is that timeline? And it makes me wonder if now is the right time to move forward with the opt-in code, given the carbon,
Impacts of that.
Intensity of the grid.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
It's not really a question, more of a comment.
Yeah, sure.
But these are troubling to me, and it make me wonder about the timing of adopting it. So thank you.
Yeah, of course.
But thank you. You guys were really, really knowledgeable.
That kind of brings up one more question.
Okay.
Bouncing off of that is the grid even able to sustain this kind of electric usage? Being that now simple storm, you're losing power for 2 days. You really, you're getting problems in the summertime where you're getting flickering of lights because people are running AC around. Is that?
Yeah.
Are they working to
So-
increase the grid capacity?
Yeah, they're absolutely.
Thank you. So 2 points. So you talk about, right, so the timing of this specialized opt-in code, given our current grid is carbon intensive, and then can the grid handle all this electrification incentivized, promoted, supported by this new building code?
Yeah, so to the second point, I would say yes, the grid can handle it, and there are the massive utility providers are looking at grid upgrade plans, I believe.
So National Grid submitted its electric sector modernization plan a couple of weeks ago to DPU. It's a behemoth document. But essentially, it identifies areas of investment and critical need based upon projected demand growth. Westford, I think, sits in the Chelmsford and Greater Lowell area, if I'm not mistaken. And I have to double check, but that was not one of the major areas of concern of load growth compared to other National Grid areas. Having said that, the ESMPs are meant to pretty much plan out when a National Grid is intends to make investments or upgrades to its substations to handle those. Extra loads. I have more to say, but I feel like I cut you off.
Sure, yeah. So what I was going to say is when it comes to the operational use of the buildings, though, the grid impacts aren't going to be as significant with new construction homes, just because typically new construction homes are built a lot more energy efficiently than the existing buildings. So when it comes to energy use, they're going to have a lot lower footprint when compared to like a home that's already online today.
My experience is though that the grid can't even handle the work that they have right now. At one project, we've been waiting 3 months for a transformer to be hung. We have no power, and it's, this is not going to make their work less, and they're not gonna put more people on. They're already trying, everybody knows, the work with less to do more. So what is do they have a real plan to do this, or are they just saying, this is something we're gonna do, we know it's coming, but, right now my experiences have been long waits, not good customer service. So we're then gonna be relying more of our needs on them, but can't even follow through on a lot of what they need to do now.
Yeah, we do acknowledge the supply chain issues when it comes to transformers. I think we're seeing it more with the pad mounted than the pole mounted transformers.
Simple pole mount.
Yeah, even so I do acknowledge that the transformers there are facing supply chain issues. I think the pole mounted transformers it's still bad, but it's getting better. But I think to your point, I acknowledge that is an issue right now.
Nothing from them, nothing. Well, this person actually ended up calling their state rep and Channel 5 and a few other places. And finally, we are now in the moved up queue. So whatever that means, we'll see.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I know the utility providers do have plans for next gen grid impacts and stuff. So I know they're certainly something they're looking
plans
into.
for it, but do they have the labor force to carry it through? It's good to say you have the plan, this is what we're gonna do, this is what we need to do it, but if they can't currently staff or supply what they are already responsible to supply, how are they gonna do, or what is their plan to do this? I mean, it seems like, well, geez, if they're saying they can do this down the road, but right now, they have a need for more, and they're not even satisfying those needs, how confident are you that they are gonna fulfill those needs when they're even more?
So if you have a specific question with this, I'm happy to direct you from a representative of them that I might have connections with through the program. So I can
This
any
is the Eversource, but
yeah, but any specific
with
question.
Eversource. With Eversource. Okay.
Yeah, so with any specific thing there, I can try to put you in touch with someone from the program if you have questions directly related to their upgrade processes.
Just an
But
experience with working with the different providers that
Yeah.
they're not real responsive, and you wait a really long time to get anything out of them. So now you're going to be relying more on them.
Yeah, this is pretty much like still a lingering effect of COVID, and I think and I know this is not like a huge consolation, but I think over the short term we should be able to see the markets normalize within the next couple of years. But like I said, I understand that there is an issue right now.
yeah, and going to some of your point too, you brought up the power outages specifically, and one thing I like to think about when I look at like new energy efficient homes built to the latest model codes and built to the stretch code and opt-in code is resiliency is a really big actually benefit of the codes. When you have a new construction, the energy or the temperature in the home tends to stay pretty consistent when the power goes out, because it has less places to escape because you're building the home so tight to the latest code requirements. And the Pacific Northwest National Laboratories actually did a really interesting study on like passive survivability, which found that building to the latest model code and actually passive house through FIA standards increases passive survivability, meaning the amount of days you can live in a home during an extreme weather event where there's a power outage. So when it comes to public health and resiliency, I think codes are actually moving in a really positive piece of that.
Yeah, and we've modeled this as well. Like we've modeled like a house that's built to either the stretch or to the specialized, like a passive house, for example, and you lose power hypothetically. Let's say it's the winter, and so you would be like your house, your living arrangements would get cooler by like a couple of degrees a day. That's how much like cold that's kind of infiltrating in. It's very, very minimal. And to the point, like if you had a fossil fuel system and you lost power, you might still be like not have that system working because there are electric thermostats.
Quality considerations into that when you no longer have power, but now you're in a really tight building. You were saying, obviously there's the humidity control and moisture, and now all of a sudden you've taken all of those balancing features away from the home.
Yeah, I think short term it's okay. Longer term, it could be more problematic generally. But I think when looking at passive survivability, you're looking at like if it's like 10 or 20 days on end, which older homes are going to have like be worse for that compared to a new home, just because you can maintain the air in. But I think longer terms, without those features like the balanced ventilation systems and things like that, there could be impacts. But short term, it's not going to be as significant, I don't think. And typically during these events, they're not super prolonged generally. They usually happen over like, you might be out for, yeah, no, absolutely. But they'll happen more over like 3 to 4 days, which I don't think will have an impact on like indoor air quality as significantly. You know, and I think it's something where like you could open a window if that's will help. But speaking to indoor air quality though, and this is again a feature of the stretch code, not of the opt-in code, but the code now requires actually a balanced ventilation system to be installed through a energy recovery ventilator or a heat recovery ventilator, so to provide continuous flow. So when you build really tight and use that kind of system, it makes sure the indoor air quality is good. But when the power goes out, there are more questions around that, so for sure.
Okay, yeah, thank you for those questions about the grid. Related is the carbon intensity of the grid. So
Oh,
Dylan, if you
yes.
could come back to that in terms
So,
of
yeah, we
why push this specialized opt-in code before our grid is fully decarbonized?
Yeah, and I think this was the point that I made on slide 3 or 4, I believe it was, that even with a fossil intense grid, like if you're building with electric resistance, which hopefully you're not anymore, then of course you are having a pretty carbon intensive heating, because electric resistance, you only get 1 unit of heat out for every kilowatt hour you put in. But air source heat pumps are just that much more efficient to a magnitude of 2.5, 3, that the carbon emissions from the grid are diminished by the same factor. And we've shown that even like with grid emissions the way they are in 2020, that heating your home with an air source heat pump is less carbon intensive. Right, you've got it right in front of you. Yeah, it's less carbon
This was
intensive.
the slide that Dylan is referring to. Yeah.
Compared to heating with like just natural gas by half. So you know, we have a carbon intensive grid, but you're using so little electricity that you know, even the additional natural gas that you have to burn to power the grid, to power your heat pump, is so small that, you know, the carbon emissions are pretty tiny in that case.
Great. So and your
that
point
you
on that
assume
was
that
still
you're
carbon
connected to the grid.
savings going to electric heating and cooling from to natural gas system.
Yeah,
On today's grid.
Yeah, you know, by definition, with gas, your maximum theoretical output is 0.05 of whatever you put in, right? So you get 95% of the heat that's contained within one methane molecule, right? But with electricity, with a heat pump, because you're getting the heat from the outside or from an additional source, you're using so little that whatever like grid impacts it's very minimal.
Okay, great. Thank you for talking about that. Thank you for that question. Okay, any other comments or questions? Anything on the Zoom? No? Okay, I think we'll wrap up. I really appreciate everybody's attention and participation. Any other comments or questions, please submit them to the town. The town government has a website. There is a link, right? A link you can click into a form and submit a comment or question. You can use my email on the town website under the Clean Energy and Sustainability Committee. Also, we're working with Tom Teller and other folks on the committee. We really thank the participation of our presenters, Dylan and Michael. Really appreciate that. Your time. Appreciate consideration from the select board and other folks in the town government to consider this. Again, we'll be providing update recommendations to the select board. And also, before leave, I did just want to thank Sue Thomas, our sustainability coordinator in town before that position was eliminated, for helping us set up this event and for getting us to this point where we are now discussing, debating, learning about this code adoption. And hopefully, we'll see you all at town meeting as appropriate. So thank you all. Have a good night.